My daughter-in-law smiled as I signed the paper. It was a waiver that promised I would never expect care or support from them. My son stood by the window, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. Something inside me gave way that day. But a week later, when my lawyer revealed the truth about my finances, their smiles faded quick. What they thought marked my end was only the beginning. It happened on Thanksgiving, the kind of holiday where the air is heavy with cinnamon and turkey, where you remind yourself to be grateful even when your heart feels unsettled. I had only been staying with Victor and Kristen a few weeks, still recovering from my hip fracture. They had insisted I come live with them during my healing. They said it would be easier for everyone. Kristen set the table like it belonged in a magazine. Pumpkin candles, folded cloth napkins shaped into little birds, everything arranged just so. She smiled the way she always did, tight and polished, eyes glossy but cold. Victor barely spoke. He scrolled on his phone, half interested, between bites of cranberry sauce. When the dishes were cleared and dessert hadn't been touched, Kristen placed a beige folder by my plate. It had no label. Still smiling, she said, "This is just a formality, something our family lawyer suggested. It's called a voluntary waiver of support. It only means you're independent. It's mostly symbolic." I looked over at Victor. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Inside, the words spelled it out plainly. I give up any right to financial help from my children. I release any expectation of care. I understand I am not legally owed emotional, physical, or financial support from Victor Ellsworth and Kristen Ellsworth, now or ever. I signed it. My hands were steady. I didn't argue. I picked up the pen, wrote my name, and slid it back to her. Kristen folded it neatly, like she was closing a thank you card. Then she handed me the sweet potato pie with marshmallows browned on top. No one ever mentioned it again. That night, I climbed the stairs back to the attic. Not the guest room, not some in-law suite. The attic. The heat barely reached that far. I had a small space heater and a fleece blanket with snowman printed on it. The next morning, the bookshelf Joseph had built for me was gone. It used to sit in the hallway corner filled with his aviation books and my recipe cards. Kristen said it made the space feel cluttered. She replaced it with a tall mirror and a basket stuffed with rolled yoga mats. The study had become Kristen's filming room. Ring lights, mats, dumbbells, and posters with words like choose joy and mind over matter. My cast itched constantly, and the stairs were a daily battle. Nobody ever offered me a cup of coffee in the morning. I don't believe they hated me. That's not what this was about. It was more like I didn't belong in their vision of the house. I didn't match the new style. I told myself it was only temporary. But then Joseph's old chair was moved into the garage. They said it looked outdated. They said they wanted to freshen things up. That's when I realized something deeper was happening. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in words. It was quiet, gradual, and deliberate. Piece by piece, they were erasing signs that I had ever been there. I wonder if you've ever felt that. Not the violence of anger, but the soft pressure of being removed for convenience. I think about it sometimes. For you listening, when did you first notice someone trying to erase you? Was it a chair taken away, a drawer emptied, a photo frame quietly replaced? I stayed silent, at least for then. I thought silence would keep the peace. But silence has edges of its own, and they cut the deepest when you're the only one bleeding. It was the second Tuesday after Thanksgiving when I finally opened the blue tin box. It had been buried at the back of the closet for more than a decade, hidden under old flannel sheets and Christmas decorations. Joseph gave it to me the year before he passed. He said it was just some paperwork he didn't want in the safe. Back then, I never questioned him. Joseph was always careful, always organized, the kind of man who believed in having backups for backups. That morning, when the house was empty, I pulled the box out. The washing machine hummed faintly downstairs. My hip still ached, but I moved slower now out of caution, not pain. Inside the tin was a stack of manila folders, all neatly labeled, all typed. A few pages carried Joseph's sharp handwriting. Notes written the way an engineer would leave instructions for another, practical, precise. I expected bank records or insurance policies. What I found instead were 20 years of investment summaries. I recognized the names of our old brokerage accounts, but the balances stopped me cold. Then I found a printout dated 3 years before his death. At the top, it didn't have his name. It had mine, IRA accounts, trust funds, municipal bonds. All diversified, all under my name. There were also quarterly reports from a financial firm in Connecticut I didn't even recall opening. But there it was, clear and real. I added up the numbers 3 times before I believed it. $77 million. Joseph had transferred everything to me gradually, starting back in the late 90s. The paperwork showed notarized dates I barely remembered. I had been busy volunteering at the library, baking for church events. I never thought to ask what he was doing in his home office night after night. Now it all made sense. Why he never worried about retirement. Why he never pushed me to go back to accounting after I quit. He had already prepared it all. Prepared for me. There was a letter too. Folded neatly behind a divider marked Marjorie, personal. It wasn't long, just a few lines. Joseph wrote that life had taught him to prepare for what we can't see coming, that if I ever found myself alone, I should know I was never truly alone. He wrote that the wealth wasn't a gift, but a recognition of what we had built together. I sat on the floor, surrounded by papers spread like wings around me. It didn't feel like power. It felt like Joseph still protecting me from shadows I hadn't faced yet. I gathered everything back into the tin. I hid it behind a row of dusty cookbooks in the far attic cabinet, a place Kristen would never bother to check. That night at dinner, Kristen talked about a new online course she was launching. She said she needed to invest in rebranding and hinted at taking out a home equity loan. Victor nodded along. I stayed quiet. I had always thought silence was soft, gentle, but that evening my silence was different. Not fear, not surrender. It was the steady pause before something begins. On a cold January morning, I walked into the living room and felt it at once. Something was missing. The oak bookshelf Joseph and I had bought in 1983 was gone. It used to hold tax manuals, gardening books, and our wedding album. Now in its place stood a sleek white bench with 2 rolled yoga mats stacked neatly on top. I stood still, my hand pressed lightly against the wall, as if I could still feel the fingerprints of our memories there. Kristen walked past with earbuds in, barely glancing at me as she headed into the kitchen. Her new routine involved green juices and a blender that roared like a jet engine. I didn't say a word. I turned around and went back upstairs. The hallway smelled of lavender spray. I opened the linen closet. My blankets were gone. In their place were rolled white towels and neatly labeled baskets. When I reached the attic, the air was cold again. Kristen claimed it was poor insulation, but the truth was she had closed off the vent. She said it helped with the energy bill. I pulled my quilt tighter around me. Over the next few days, little things vanished. Framed photos from my room. The clay dish Joseph had given me on our 10th anniversary. Even the old pillow with my initials stitched into the corner. Kristen never said a thing, neither did Victor. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw the refrigerator covered in Kristen's printed schedules, workout calendars, smoothie prep plans, and a quote taped in the center that read, "Let go of what no longer serves you." I made myself tea and sat quietly at the counter. In the pocket of my apron, I kept a small notebook. That morning I began a list. Every object that disappeared, every wall that was repainted, every trace of my presence that dissolved into her new order of the house. Monday, bookshelf gone. Tuesday, hallway rugs replaced with foam tiles. Wednesday, coat hooks removed. When the recording clicked off, he nodded slowly. I pulled out the small voice recorder I'd hidden inside my knitting basket. It was old, the kind Joseph once used for lectures. I changed the batteries, tested the button, and slipped it into my robe pocket. That evening, Kristen came into my room with her overly sweet voice. She asked if I needed help uploading my Medicare forms. I pressed record. At first the conversation was ordinary, technical, but then she slipped. She mentioned she had already filled out some of my preferences for the advance directive. She said it lightly, with a laugh, as if it were no big deal. But I heard the pride in her tone, the control. I smiled and thanked her. After she left, I saved the file. On a new index card I wrote, March 15th, directive preferences altered before consent given. I knew exactly what she was doing, closing doors from the inside, creating a world where my choices disappeared one quiet form at a time. But I was building something too. It didn't look like a fight. It looked like peace, folders, notes, recordings, patience. I wasn't signing anything else. I wasn't asking for explanations. I was watching, waiting. Because I had learned something vital. When someone tries to silence you with smiles and papers, the most powerful thing you can do is keep the record, not for revenge, but for truth. And truth was stacking up file by file in the attic. The room they thought I had forgotten, but I hadn't. Not even close. The next morning, sunlight crept across the floorboards of my room. When I came downstairs, something in the living room stopped me cold. The mantel was bare. Joseph's photo was gone. So was the flag from his service. Even the rosewood urn holding his wedding ring had vanished. In their place stood a jade plant and a framed motivational quote. Kristen stood nearby, fluffing a pillow. She hummed softly to herself. I stared at the empty space above the fireplace. She caught my look and smiled. She said the house needed to breathe, that too much nostalgia blocked new energy. She spoke of realignment and renewal, as if erasing memory could be healing. I didn't answer. I walked to the window and rested my hands on the sill. The silence stretched until she filled it. She said she had packed everything neatly into a labeled storage bin. Safe, she said. Then she left, without waiting for a response. I didn't go searching for the box. I didn't want to see how neatly my past had been folded away. Later that afternoon, while Kristen was out running errands and Victor was on a call, I went into my room. It had changed again. The quilt I had carried from my old house was gone, replaced with a gray coverlet that looked clean but cold. The lace curtains had been swapped for blackout panels. The shelf that once held the anniversary clock Joseph gave me was empty. In its place sat a diffuser and a stack of self-help books I had never opened. I opened my closet. The scarves Joseph used to bring me back from his work trips, bright silks from small-town shops, were missing. Later, I found them stuffed into a donation bag in the garage. I reached in and pulled one out, a pale blue silk with tiny yellow flowers. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. It felt like reclaiming a breath. That night, I sat at the foot of my bed and looked around. The room no longer belonged to me. The lavender scent I'd once used was replaced by peppermint. The angles of the furniture felt foreign, rearranged to someone else's taste. So I made one small change. From the back of my dresser drawer, I pulled out the only photo I had managed to keep from my old house. It was taken the summer after Joseph retired. We were standing under a maple tree, his arm around my shoulder, both of us squinting against the light. That was when we first started managing our little investments together. Neither of us knew then what it would grow into. I found a small wooden frame, one of the few things Kristen hadn't touched. I placed the photo inside and set it on the knitstand, angled toward my pillow. No one noticed at first. The next morning, Kristen walked by with a laundry basket. She paused at the doorway, just for a second. I didn't look up from my book. She said nothing. Later, I saw her downstairs rearranging shelves again, her jaw tight. That afternoon, a woman from church brought me lily. I set them beside Joseph's photo on my knitstand. That evening, I lit a small candle next to it, not dramatic, just a quiet flame beside the picture of the life we had built. I wasn't only defending memory anymore, I was drawing a boundary. The scarf, the photo, the candle. Symbols of a self that refused to vanish. That night, I added a new line in my log. March 23rd, memorial items removed without notice. Reclaimed one scarf, restored one photograph. The list grew longer, but so did my resolve. They had taken the altar, but they hadn't taken my belief in Joseph. In us, in the deliberate act of remembering. I was no longer just preserving, I was preparing. The morning began like any other. Kristen blended her kale smoothie in the kitchen. Victor sat at the island, scrolling on his phone. I was on the back porch with a shawl wrapped around my shoulders, the pale blue one I had rescued from the donation bag. I had just finished updating my notebook when I stepped back inside. Voices drifted from the study. Kristen's was bright, pitched like a saleswoman closing a deal. Another voice answered, a clipped professional tone I didn't recognize. I stopped just outside the door, hidden. They were discussing the house. Transfer titles, ownership percentages. Kristen said Victor's name. Her own name, then mine, but only like a footnote. The man replied that the paperwork could be finalized before the week was over if all signatures were in place. I felt something lock in my chest. When Kristen stepped out and saw me standing there, she didn't flinch. She smiled and gestured toward the hallway as though nothing had happened. She said they were just exploring options. Planning ahead, I nodded slowly and walked to the living room. I sat down on the couch, the same spot where Joseph used to read the Sunday paper. My hands rested in my lap, steady. For the first time in weeks, they didn't tremble. Minutes later, Victor appeared holding a folder. He avoided my eyes. He said the notary had arrived for some routine updates. I asked him what kind of updates. His voice faltered. Kristen answered for him, placing a stack of papers on the coffee table. She said it was just formalizing things, that it made sense for the home to be in the names of those actively maintaining it. I asked her if that meant removing me. She didn't answer. She just tapped the pen against the signature line. That was when I stood up. Not fast, not dramatic, but steady. I told them aloud what I had already known for months. This house no longer felt like mine. Kristen looked irritated. Victor looked ashamed. I picked up one of the documents and skimmed it. The phrasing was familiar. Joseph had taught me enough about contracts to recognize one rewritten to seize control. This wasn't a formality. This was a transfer. I looked at my son. I told him this was the moment when silence became complicity. Then I turned to Kristen. I said the memories in that house were once sacred. Every corner carried something Joseph and I had built. The bookshelves, the porch swing, even the stain on the kitchen floor where he had dropped a bottle of Merlot and laughed until tears ran down his face. I said the house might not be mine anymore, but the truth of what had happened inside it always would be, and no signature could erase that. Kristen crossed her arms and said the past couldn't be the foundation for every decision. I nodded. Then I walked upstairs. I didn't take the papers. I didn't tear them up. I just left them on the table, untouched, as if they had never mattered. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept the flash drive Gary had given me. On it were every financial record Joseph had ever entrusted to him, investments, deeds, the foundation plans. I updated my notes carefully. March 29th, attempted erasure through asset reassignment. Witnessed, recorded, consent not given. Then I wrote one sentence in all capital letters. I am still here. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I asked Victor to drive me to Gary's office. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, grabbed his keys, and led me out the door. Kristen stayed behind. The car ride was quiet. Right before we pulled into the lot, I looked at Victor and said, "Thank you. Not for helping me, but for showing me how much he had changed and how much I hadn't." Inside Gary's office, I handed him the notebook, the flash drive, and the recordings. He opened his legal pad and began working. I wasn't erasing anyone. I was choosing to preserve what mattered, in the only way I knew with clarity, and no permission needed. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed. The silence in my room was sharper than usual. Not the silence of being ignored, not the silence of being forgotten. It was the kind of silence that comes after clarity, not peace, but purpose. On the nightstand lay my notebook, open, the flash drive tucked into its pocket. Everything was labeled, numbered, organized. That's what decades of bookkeeping had taught me. Numbers don't lie. They remember even when people choose not to. The hallway light cast a shadow across the floor. Kristen's voice carried faintly from downstairs. She was pacing on another call, words too sharp to ignore. I didn't lean closer. Not yet. Instead, I reached into my drawer and pulled out the small black recorder. I clicked it on, let the red light blink, and pressed record. My voice was dry at first. I cleared my throat. April 2nd. Recording number 36. Subject: full observation of private conversation regarding medical authority and financial transfer. I walked to the top of the stairs. Kristen's voice grew clearer. She was telling someone the medical paperwork would be easier once my name was removed. That the insurance company needed a clean file. She mentioned the house again. using words like consolidating ownership and tax deferment. Her tone was rehearsed, smooth. She even asked if a revocation of next of kin rights could be pushed through under cognitive grounds. She used the word frailty. I repeated it under my breath, frailty. I clicked off the recorder. That night, I played it back, every word crisp. Instead of shaking, I smiled, not out of joy, but because there were no shadows left. No questions. Everything was in the light now. I added the new audio file to the flash drive. Then I opened the foundation documents Gary had sent me, the Joseph M. Ellsworth Foundation. Every clause was airtight, every transfer written under the guidelines Joseph and I had once discussed. I typed up a letter to Gary confirming the schedule to finalize everything. I read over the section that listed beneficiaries. Kristen's name wasn't there, neither was Victor's. The foundation would stand alone, separate, untouchable. It would carry Joseph's name. It would fund scholarships for women starting over, for those who had been silenced. Women like me. I thought back to the first time I touched a ledger. I was 16, tracking the bake sale funds at church. I had loved the order of it, the way numbers lined up, the way each column told a truth that couldn't be argued away. That memory steadied me now. The next morning, I came downstairs early. Kristen had her yoga mat spread across the living room. She didn't look up. Victor was in the kitchen making coffee. He gave me a stiff nod. I poured myself a glass of water and walked past them both without a word. At the post office, the clerk smiled as I slid the thick envelope across the counter. She joked it looked like I was mailing a novel. I smiled back and said, "In a way, it is." When I returned home, no one asked where I had been. That afternoon, I wandered the backyard slowly. The grass was soft with spring, and tulips had begun to push through near the fence. I bent down and touched one. Yellow, the same shade Joseph once painted our garden bench. That evening, I made another recording, April 3rd, recording 37, subject: Final thoughts before legal execution of transfer documents. I spoke clearly. I said I had not been erased. I had been removed, yes, dismissed, silenced. But I had not disappeared, because memory is not a room, and family is not a signature. I clicked the recorder off and set it in the safe beside my bed. Then I sat in the armchair by the window and watched the sunlight slide across the neighbor's roof. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. This wasn't revenge. It was preservation. And I had never been more certain. It rained lightly that morning, just enough to blur the edges of the street. I wore Joseph's old wool coat and walked carefully down the church steps, mindful of the slick concrete. Gary stood by the curb holding a thick folder under his arm. He gave me a single nod. We didn't need words. Inside the fellowship hall, 3 folding chairs sat side by side, dot across from them. A simple table with a white runner was set. On it lay the signed declaration of the foundation, a framed photo of Joseph in his gray cardigan, and a vase of marigolds. Kristen arrived last. Her heels clicked hard against the floor, her shoulders stiff. Victor trailed behind, his eyes fixed on the ground. Neither spoke to me. They sat in silence. Gary opened the folder and began reading. His voice was steady, factual. He described the Joseph M. Ellsworth Foundation, its mission, its legal structure. He read the statement that every asset under my name had been transferred irrevocably into its custody. He listed the witnesses present. Then he said clearly that no member of the Ellsworth household was named a beneficiary. The air in the hall shifted. Kristen crossed her arms, but she didn't speak. Victor leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, as if something inside him finally gave way. Gary read the final clause. The house on Maple Hill Lane would be vacated within 30 days. No portion of it would pass to its current residents. It would serve instead as the administrative home of the foundation. I sat still, silent. Then, from the back of the hall, 3 women entered. Cheryl, May, Doreen, each carried something small. Cheryl held the first grant letter, addressed to a woman in Wisconsin. May brought the nonprofit registration certificate. Doreen placed a lit candle beside Joseph's picture. I watched Kristen's expression falter. Her hands stayed in her lap, her face pale. She wasn't used to being unseen in a room where decisions were being made. Victor turned toward me. I saw the flicker of words on his lips, but nothing came out. Gary signed the last page and handed me the pen. I wrote my name carefully, each stroke steady. No trembling, no hesitation. When I finished, I closed the folder and stood. "Thank you," I said softly to the women beside me. That was all. We didn't linger. We didn't celebrate. The candle stayed lit long after we left. I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. The silence I had carried for months had finally been given form. Not through shouting, not through tears. Through clarity, through truth. And in that stillness, I had spoken louder than ever before. The sky above Maple Hill Lane was pale and still. I stood at the end of the driveway with my suitcase by my side. Joseph's coat was folded neatly over my arm. The house looked quieter than ever, though people still lived inside. A wind moved through the trees, rustling the few leaves left clinging to their branches. I took one last look at the upstairs windows. Those panes once filled with soft morning light when Joseph and I sat reading side by side. The blinds were down now. I didn't feel sadness. Not anymore. What I felt was closer to release. Something inside me had finally unfastened after being held tight for too long. In my coat pocket was the letter Joseph wrote me on my 65th birthday. I hadn't read it in years, but that morning, I unfolded the worn paper. The edges were soft with age, but the handwriting was still strong. He had written about the time we built a little bookshelf together, about how I double-checked every bank statement, even when he told me I didn't have to. He said I gave shape to things, that I held memory when others forgot. The last line stayed with me. Do not let them define the love you lived. I pressed the page to my chest before tucking it safely away again. That house was no longer mine. But the life I had lived inside would never belong to anyone else. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, my steps steady. At the corner, Doreen waited in her car. She lifted her hand in a quiet wave. No words were needed. As we drove away, I looked over my shoulder once, not to say goodbye, but to acknowledge what I was leaving. Not bitterness, not loss, just a chapter closed. One I had finished in my own handwriting. Somewhere ahead, a new place waited. It wouldn't have my name on the deed, not yet. There would be no photos on the walls. But it would have something more important: space, light. Silence I could choose, not the kind I had to endure. And in that silence, I would begin again. If you've ever felt invisible in the home you helped build, or silenced in the spaces you once filled with love, know this. Your story matters. Your memory has weight. And like me, you hold the power to reclaim it. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.